Okay, so now we're going to talk about the function of synovial joints. So remember, synovial joints are all diarthrotic. If we classify them based on function, it's because they are freely movable. They contain a joint cavity, so they're freely movable. And synovial joints are called synovial or classified as synovial because of the presence of a synovial membrane. We can further classify, so there are 6 different types of synovial joints, and we can further classify them based on the types of movements that they allow, all right? So the movement that they allow within a plane or around particular axes. So here, this is some terminology, and we're going to go through, I'll give you some examples of these. So bones and synovial joints can move in different planes or around an axis or multiple axes. And so the possible configurations are non-axial joints. So a non-axial synovial joint would be between 2 bones that just slide past one another. So it's moving in multiple planes, but it does not move around an axis. So this is going to be a gliding or a plane joint. The bones just slide past one another. Uniaxial joints are formed between bones that can move, that they allow motion around one axis. So these bones move around one axis. Uni meaning one. Biaxial joints allow motion around 2 axes, increasing the number of movements allowed there. And then multiaxial joints allow motion around 3 axes, further increasing the types of movements allowed at that particular synovial joint. And so the next couple of slides helps you understand what uniaxial, biaxial, and multiaxial means, okay, by showing you the different axes. So this is an example of a uniaxial joint. This is your elbow joint. Now I'm going to go ahead and call it a hinge joint. We haven't learned that yet, but hinge is a specific type of synovial joint, and this is what it's demonstrated. Hinge joints are uniaxial. This is what's demonstrated here. And if you think about a hinge on a door, what does a door do? It opens and closes, opens and closes. It moves around one axis and one axis only. So just like a hinge on a door, hinge synovial joints allow movement around one axis. So the axis is going in this direction. This hinge joint would be between, this is the humerus and the ulna. And this is why learning the bones helps. I made you do that chapter because it helps you understand joints. This would be the trochlea. Remember the trochlea, this would be the coronoid fossa on the back, on the posterior side, there would be the olecranon fossa. And then here's the proximal end of the ulna. We have that U-shaped trochlear notch. We have an olecranon process and a coronoid process. Those are all the structures that make up this hinge joint. And what's allowed here is just like a hinge on a door, is just close, open, flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. There's no other movements allowed at this joint, and that's around one axis. That's a uniaxial joint. Okay, so anywhere where there's a hinge joint, hinge joints are uniaxial. Now this is showing you an example of a biaxial joint. This is showing you a specific joint located at the metacarpophalangeal joint. So between the metacarpal bones and the proximal phalanx. Remember, you have metacarpals. These are the bones of your palm, okay? So we have metacarpal 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then here, these would all be your proximal phalanx bones, okay? The first bone of your digits, of your phalanges, all right? So this is showing you the 2 axes. First, there's an axis running in this direction. Now this joint between the metacarpal and the proximal phalanx, if we're moving around this axis, this is going to allow pretty much like the closing of your fingers and the opening. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension, all right? So that's movement around this axis. But there's also another axis, and this axis would be running into and out of the plane of the fingers, all right, but right here between the metacarpals and the proximal phalanx. So this axis runs in this direction, all right? Now this movement between these bones around this axis allows the spreading of your fingers and the closing of your fingers. This is abduction if you spread your fingers, and if you close your fingers, that's adduction. Abduction is spreading, adduction is closing. This has a B in it, ABD. This is adduction, ADD, okay? They're adding them back together, all right? So this is showing you this metacarpal phalangeal joints. If you see terms like this, don't be scared. Break down the word. You know what metacarpals are. They're the bones of the palms, right? Metacarpal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Phalangeal, you know those are your phalanges or your fingers. So a metacarpophalangeal joint is going to be between the metacarpal and the proximal phalanx, right? This is an example. We haven't learned this yet, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce the terminology here. This is an example of an ellipsoidal or a condylar joint, and it allows for, we see flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and then you can even, so if you take your finger and you make a circular motion, that's circumduction as well, right? So this is a biaxial joint. We have two axes, and we get a larger range of motion than what we saw with a uniaxial hinge joint, which is just flexion, extension, flexion, extension. So the more axes we add, the more movements we can get out of that joint. And then here, this is showing you a multi-axial joint, which an example of a multi-axial joint would be your glenohumeral joint. So glenohumeral between the glenoid cavity of the scapula and the head of the humerus, okay? Your shoulder joint, that's an example of a multi-axial joint. We'll learn this in the next video, but it's called your shoulder joint. The specific type of synovial joint it's called a ball and socket joint, all right? It's a multi-axial joint, so there's movement around 3 axes. So what this is showing you, so here's an axis running this direction, so think from shoulder to shoulder, okay? Now, movement around this axis would allow flexion at the shoulder, extension at the shoulder, and even hyperextension past normal anatomical position, all right? Now, there's a second axis. This would be going into and out of the shoulder, so running in this direction, all right? And so movement around this axis is going to allow abduction, so moving the arm further away from the midline of the body, and adduction, bringing the arm, so at movement at the shoulder, bringing the arm back towards the midline. So away and back to. Abduction, adduction, right? Now there's a third axis. So this axis is running straight up and down. Now movement around this axis allows for lateral rotation at the shoulder joint, medial rotation, lateral rotation, and medial rotation. So again, the more axes that you add at a joint, the more axes that allow movement around, the more movements we can get at that particular joint. All right, so we see rotation here added. All right, so the types of movements that are allowed by synovial joints. So now you should understand when we get into the specific types of synovial joints, like a plane joint, a hinge joint, condylar joint, saddle joint, ball and socket joint, you should be able to tell me if it's non-axial, uniaxial, biaxial, or multi-axial, okay? All right, so, and I'll address that as we move through the specific types of synovial joints in the next video. But movements at synovial joints, now we're gonna, this part of the video will be very helpful if you actually kind of Usually what I do when I'm in a lecture classroom is I get everyone to stand up and we do these movements together. So we're moving and doing them at the same time that I'm talking about it. So that will probably be helpful for you to do here is imitate. The next couple of slides shows images of a person moving. You should try to mimic or do these movements yourself while saying the specific movement term, like flexion and extension. And then I also have a video that I found on YouTube with an individual who teaches more kinesiology type courses, but it's very good and he demonstrates a lot of these movements. So I posted that on our Canvas as well. All right, so if you ever hear the term gliding movements, this is just sliding. So the bones, the articulating surfaces of two bones, just slide past one another. It's a gliding movement. It's non-axial because there's no movement around an axis. They just slide past one another. And then we have angular movements, which will increase or decrease angles between articulating bones. All right, so let's start going through some of these. Let's talk about the angular types of motions that we can get. Okay, we can read through this, but I'm going to flip to this page. All right, so flexion and extension. So in this, I'm going to go through this quickly because it's better if you just do this yourself and watch the video where you can see the guy actually carrying out these movements. This right here is showing, again with with synovial movement, with movements at synovial joints, you should always think anatomical position, all right? What's anatomical position? Standing upright, arms slightly out to the side, palms facing forward, feet about hip width apart, toes facing forward, neutral neck, so just staring straight ahead. We're not staring up or down. You always want to refer back to anatomical position, and that's because these movements are so complex that an individual, you can't really just say up, down, right, left, to the side, or closer. I mean, we can't use those terms to describe these movements because whether or not the individual, like if you're working on a patient that's lying face down or lying face up or on their right side or left side or standing or sitting, it changes, and so we need to be consistent in our descriptions so everything is standardized to anatomical position, okay? Now, what this is showing, so if you were to, this is flexion of the arm at the elbow. Now going back, and this is extension at the arm at the elbow. And so your elbow joint, which is a hinge joint, only allows for flexion and extension. Flexion and extension. So make sure you're doing these movements as I go through it. Now your shoulder joint, so the shoulder joint, if you just bring your arm up, okay, this is flexion, back down to anatomical position, that's an extension. Now if you take your entire arm and bring it backward, okay, bring it back past normal anatomical position, this is hyperextension at the shoulder. So flexion, extension, past normal anatomical position is hyperextension. Hip joint. So shoulder joint's a ball and socket joint. Hip joint is also a ball and socket joint. So if you standing upright in anatomical position, and if you lift your foot off the ground in front of you, right, anteriorly, this is flexion at the hip. Normal anatomical position, as in like a standing position, this is an extension at the hip. Bringing the foot back past behind you, past normal anatomical position, this is hyperextension at the hip. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Your neck, so the synovial joints between the vertebrae of the neck allow for lateral flexion to one side and lateral flexion to the other side. So if you were to just try to bring this ear closer to your shoulder or this ear closer to your shoulder, both are examples of lateral flexion. We can also have lateral flexion of the vertebrae that make up the thoracic, so the trunk, the vertebrae that are found in the trunk of the body. And you can have lateral flexion in either direction here as well. Okay? Abduction and adduction. So ab with a B or add with ADD. Okay, so ABD. What I like to think abduction, so if someone gets abducted, they get taken away, right? So this is a body part moving away from the midline of the body. And then adduction, you're adding that body part back to the midline of the body. And so I'll talk about circumduction in just a second. So over here, all right, so shoulder joint. If we're making a snow angel, right? And we bring your arms, so we move your arms at the shoulder away from the midline of the body. This is abduction because they're going away. If we bring your arms back towards the midline of the body, back to anatomical position, this is adduction. So abduction, adduction at the shoulder. Here's our hand. We can have an imaginary midline down the middle of our hand. If we spread our fingers away from the midline, this is abduction. If we spread our toes, this is abduction. If we bring our fingers back together, this is adduction. If we bring our toes back together, this is adduction. All right? Now, circumduction is the addition. So if you take flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, and you add those movements all together, and you try to just like add it and do all of those really quickly, what you end up with is circumduction. And so if you take so this is circumduction at the shoulder. If you were to do big arm circles at the shoulder, that is circumduction, okay? You can do the same thing at the hip joint. You can do big leg circles at your hip. That is also circumduction, all right? Rotation is, so you can have rotation, but at the between the cervical vertebrae of your neck, and more specifically between so you remember learning the cervical vertebrae. There were two cervical vertebrae that you needed to know, the atlas, which is C1, and the axis, which is C2. The axis, C2, has that den structure, that tooth-like projection that sticks straight up, and it's the atlas, or C1, that rotates around it. Those two bones allow for rotation of the head. And so rotation of the head is specifically between these two cervical vertebrae. So atlantoaxial, right? The atlas axial joint, all right, between C1 and C2. The other joints that allow for rotation will be your hip joint. So if you're standing upright and you just slide your toes and you point your toes inward like here, that's internal rotation. Then if you take your toes and you point them outward, that's external rotation at the hip, all right? So make sure you're doing these movements as I talk about them because it makes more sense if you actually move your body around. So your hip joint, this ball and socket joint, allows for internal and external rotation. So if you like bring your toes in, right? I think they call it like pigeon-toed, right? That's internal rotation. Then if you point your toes outward while standing, that's external rotation at the hip. Here, this is demonstrating external rotation and internal rotation at the shoulder joint, which is also a ball and socket joint. So those are examples of rotation. Special movements, so these are, and as I go through the specific synovial joints in the next video, I'll talk about each specific synovial joint and which movements they allow for, all right? But the fact that we've already gone through these movements, it will make even more sense as I repeat them with each specific synovial joint. All right, so these movements, I'm going to use these pictures. All right, so opposition and reposition. These are highly specialized movements only allowed at one joint, and it's the joint between the trapezium, which is a specific carpal bone. Remember, there are 8 carpal bones of your wrist. So between the trapezium and metacarpal 1, which is going to the thumb, that is a special type of synovial joint called a saddle joint. And that highly specialized saddle joint allows for opposition of the thumb. So if you take your thumb and you touch your pinky, that's opposition. That's your opposable thumb. Then if you put your thumb back in normal anatomical position, like in this image, that's reposition. So opposition, reposition. Your opposable thumb. What does that allow for? Why? It's so highly specialized, and it's really, it's a good thing for humans to have an opposable thumb. Why? It allows for grasping. If you did not have an opposable thumb, you would not be able to grasp or hold on to things. Think about that, okay? Do that, and then think about not having a thumb. It'd be very difficult to do a lot of daily tasks. So that's opposition and reposition, highly specialized movement between the trapezium, which is a carpal bone, and metacarpal 1 of the thumb, okay? Depression and elevation. So the mandible, your mandible maxillary, so the mandible joint, mandibular joint, is a modified hinge joint. And it allows for, so if you drop your jaw, that's called depression. If you close your mouth, that's called elevation of the mandible. You can also have elevation and depression of your scapula. So if you shrug your shoulders, that's elevation of the scapula. Or if you depress your shoulders or bring them down, that's depression of your scapula. How could I ask these movements on the test? I could describe. So if I were to, what's the specific movement when you turn your head from side, if you look from right to left, as in a no movement. So if you signal no to someone with your head, what is that called? Rotation. What joint or what bones allow for that rotation? C1 and C2, okay? So I could describe these movements to you, very similar to how these, PowerPoint slides have it described. I could describe a movement to you, and you will have to tell me, is it flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, circumduction, rotation, opposition, reposition, things like that, okay? So I will ask this on the test. I'll give you some sort of description of the movement, and you'll have to tell me the name of that specific type of movement, all right? What is it called when you shrug your shoulders? It's blank of the scapula. You would tell me elevation, all right? If I describe you touch your thumb to your pinky, what is that movement called? You would say opposition. If you drop your jaw, as in, an astonished look, dropping your jaw is called what of the mandible? Depression, all right? Okay, so some more specialized movements. Protraction, retraction, inversion, and eversion. So let's go to this. So if you were to take your mandible and project it out, right? I think that's called an underbite. So if it looked kind of like an underbite, and you project your mandible out anteriorly, that's called protraction of the mandible. If you bring that mandible in, as in like an overbite, right? Where the maxillary bone really projects over the mandible. This is retraction of the mandible. You can also have protraction and retraction of the scapula. So if I kind of pull my shoulders forward, spreading the scapula apart further, right? Bringing them further away from the midline, this is protraction. And then if I take my shoulders and I really pull them back, as in like active shoulders, I stand up real tall and pull my shoulders back, really puff out my chest, right? That's retraction of the scapula, right? So we can have protraction and retraction of the scapula as well. Now, the ankle joint is a unique type of hinge joint in that it allows more than just, flexion and extension. And we actually have some specialized terms for flexion and extension at the ankle joint. But it's a unique joint. Your ankle is pretty unique. And so some of the movements allowed, and that's why they have these specialized movement names, is because of the uniqueness of the movements allowed there. So if you take the bottom of your feet, the plantar surface of your feet, bottom, and you point the bottom of your feet inward, so towards the midline, this is called an inversion. So the plantar surface is facing inward towards the midline of the body, inversion. If you take the plantar surface and you point it outwards, laterally, that's called eversion, eversion of the foot. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. All right, so this is again at your ankle joint. Dorsiflexion is this first image right here. And so think of, you have your heel, your calcaneus on the ground, and you lift your toes and the balls of your feet up, where only your heel remains on the ground. This is dorsiflexion, all right? So the angle between the foot and the leg decreases. So this angle right here decreases. Just think of it that you're trying to bring the top of your foot closer to the anterior surface of your leg. This is dorsiflexion. Now, if you point your toes like a dancer would, like a little ballerina, right? So now, instead of only the heel touching the ground, your toes and the ball of your foot would touch the ground, and you would elevate your heel off of the ground. This is plantar flexion of the foot. So if you point your toes like a dancer, this is plantar flexion, all right? Again, these are specialized terms because the ankle joint is unique, all right? Special movements continued. So supination and pronation. This is a specialized rotational movement, and it's specific to supination and pronation is specific to the movement between the radius and the ulna, all right? So the head of the radius fits into the radial notch of the ulna. And then down here at the distal end of the radius and the ulna, we have the ulnar head that fits into the ulnar notch of the radius. And we have these specialized ligaments that encircle those structures, and it allows for this specialized rotation around the radius and the ulna. Now, when you are in an anatomical position and your palms are facing forward, you are in a supine, your forearm, your radius and ulna are supinated. And if you think about it, you can hold a bowl of soup like this. So you could hold a bowl of soup, that's supinated. Now, if you were to rotate your radius and ulna, and now instead of being in anatomical position with palms facing forward, now we have our palms facing posteriorly. That's a pronated position. That's called pronation. So do it with me. You're in anatomical position and your palms are facing forward. Now face your palms posteriorly. That's pronation. Face your palms anteriorly. Supination. Face your palms posteriorly. That's pronation, all right? It's a specialized rotational movement around the radius and the ulna, right? And it allows for more dynamic movement of our arms. So if you think about not being able to rotate between the radius and the ulna, think of not being able to do that very quickly, that rotational movement around your radius and the ulna. That would be very difficult to do. It's just everyday task. If you had to try to move your entire shoulder joint to get your palm to face posteriorly or anteriorly, okay? So again, that's specialized movements. It's a specialized rotational movement around the radius and the ulna. When we get to the pivot joint, A pivot joint is a specific type of synovial joint. That is what is allowing this. It's the pivot joints between the radius and the ulna that allow for supination and pronation. All right. And this is just a little study boost. It helps with the understanding supination. So hold a cup of soup. That's when your hand is supinated. Or if you pour it out, that's when your hand is pronated. That's a specialized rotational movement between the radius and the ulna. Abduction, when you abduct something, you take it away. So you're moving something further away from the midline. Whereas adduction, you're adding it back to the body. And that's how I've always remembered it too. That's how it was taught to me. Okay, range of motion. When you hear the term range of motion, it's the amount of movement a joint is capable of under normal circumstances. So range of motion of knee. The range of motion of a knee, and it's just, okay, so a knee is a hinge joint, and it allows for flexion and extension, and that's it. There are other hinge joints that allow for flexion and extension only. So not all, so when we talk about, okay, ball and socket, all right, let's do that. I like ball and socket joint when I talk about range of motion. Your shoulder is a ball and socket joint. Your hip is a ball and socket joint. They both allow for the same types of movements. So try to do this with me, even though you can't see me. So at your shoulder joint, you can have flexion, extension, hyperextension. You can have abduction. You can have adduction. You can have circumduction, and you can have internal and external rotation. Sometimes also referred to as medial and lateral rotation. You can have the same movements at your hip joint. So at the hip, that's also a ball and socket. You can have flexion, extension, hyperextension, abduction, adduction, circumduction, and you can have internal and external rotation. All right, so your shoulder joint and your hip joint, both ball and socket, and they allow for the same types of movements. But the range of motion is different because if you think about, just do circumduction with your shoulder real fast. You can make huge circles with your shoulder joint. It has a huge range of motion. Now try to do circumduction with your hip joint. Although you can still do circumduction, it's not as, the range of motion is a little more limited at your hip because your hip joint is way more sturdy. Your hip has to be able to distribute weight down through the femur into the knee. You want your hips to be pretty solid. Even though it allows for a lot of movement, you want your hips to be more stable than your shoulder. That's why your shoulder is very easily dislocated. It's not nearly as stable as the ball and socket joint of your hip. So that's kind of that's how I like to demonstrate how range of motion and how you can have identical types of synovial joints like ball and socket, shoulder joint ball and socket, hip joint ball and socket, but within those two ball and socket joints, even though they can carry out the same movements, the range of motion is going to be more limited at the hip because of the function of the hip needs to be more stable. All right, because it really has to disperse weight down through the femur, whereas the shoulder doesn't really have to disperse a lot of weight or anything, okay?